What if a single decision could lead to a war that lasts for years? What if one moment, one choice made inside a royal palace could bring entire cities to the edge of destruction? This is the story of the Trojan War, one of the most famous conflicts of the ancient Greek world, not because of how it began, but because of how it ended. The Trojan War is one of the most well-known stories of the ancient Greek world. It takes place between the city of Troy, located on the coast across the Aegean Sea, and a coalition of Greek city-states. The conflict does not begin with a battle, but with an incident in a royal court. Helen, the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta, leaves with Paris, a prince of Troy. This act is seen as a serious insult across the Greek world. Helen is not only a queen, but also a figure of great political importance. In response, Menelaus calls upon other Greek kings for support. Many of them answer. Soon, a large alliance is formed, bringing together some of the most powerful leaders and warriors of the time. Among them are Achilles, Odysseus, and Agamemnon. When the Greek forces arrive at the shores of Troy, the war does not end quickly. Troy is a well-fortified city, protected by strong walls. It cannot be taken easily by direct attack. As a result, the conflict turns into a long siege. Years pass, and neither side gains a decisive advantage. The Greeks remain outside the city, maintaining their camps along the coast, while the Trojans continue their lives within the safety of their walls. There are battles and skirmishes, but the war becomes a test of endurance rather than constant fighting. Both sides wait for the other to weaken. Over time, the situation becomes difficult for everyone involved. The long duration of the war creates fatigue, uncertainty, and frustration. Yet neither side is willing to give up. What began as a personal conflict has now become a matter of honor and power. Even after many years, the walls of Troy still stand. The Greeks begin to realize that force alone may not be enough to win the war. They start to consider a different approach. At this point, Odysseus, known for his intelligence, proposes a new plan. Instead of attacking the city directly, he suggests using strategy and deception. Odysseus's idea is simple but dangerous. The Greeks would build a massive wooden horse and leave it outside the gates of Troy as an apparent offering. At the same time, the rest of the Greek army would appear to sail away, giving the impression that the long war was finally over. For the people of Troy, this would seem like a victory. After years of siege, they would believe that the Greeks had accepted defeat and returned home. The large wooden horse would remain behind as a symbol of surrender. The plan depends entirely on one thing: convincing the Trojans to bring the horse inside their city walls. The Greeks carefully construct it. Hidden inside its hollow interior are selected warriors, chosen for their discipline and patience. Among them is Odysseus himself, the architect of the strategy. When the Greek ships disappear over the horizon, the people of Troy begin to celebrate. For the first time in many years, the city feels relief. Its gates open. Its people gather outside the walls to inspect what has been left behind. Some are suspicious. A few warn that the horse could be a trick. But after so many years of conflict, hope is stronger than caution. The horse is pulled into the city. That night, Troy celebrates. The streets fill with music, conversation, and the confidence that the war has finally ended. Inside the horse, however, the hidden soldiers remain completely silent. They wait in darkness for the city to fall asleep. Hours pass, the celebrations fade, the streets grow quiet, and when the city is finally still, the soldiers emerge. They move quickly through the darkness toward the gates of Troy. Once there, they open them from within. Beyond the walls, the Greek fleet has not truly departed. It is only hidden nearby, waiting for this exact moment. As soon as the gates are opened, the Greek army returns and enters the city. What years of direct battle could not achieve is accomplished in a single night. Troy, which had resisted for so long, falls not through force, but through deception. The city is overwhelmed before it can organize a defense. Its long resistance comes to an end, and with that, one of the most famous wars of the ancient world is finally over. The story of the Trojan horse becomes one of history's most enduring lessons. Sometimes, the outcome of great conflicts is decided not by strength alone, but by strategy. After the fall of Troy, the war comes to an end, but the story does not. For the Greek soldiers, victory does not bring immediate peace. Years of war have changed them, and the journey home will not be simple. Some leave quickly, eager to return to their families and lands. Others remain for a time, dealing with the aftermath of a long conflict. The city they fought for so many years is now silent. What was once strong and protected has fallen in a single night. Among the leaders, the returns are very different. Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces, sails back to his kingdom. But his story does not end in triumph. When he arrives home, he is met not with celebration, but with betrayal. Odysseus, the one who created the plan of the wooden horse, faces a much longer journey. His return to Ithaca becomes a long and difficult voyage, filled with obstacles and delays. Instead of a direct path home, he spends years at sea encountering unknown lands and challenges. His story becomes one of endurance rather than victory. For Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, the end of the war never truly arrives. His fate had already been sealed before the fall of Troy, reminding everyone that even the strongest cannot escape destiny. As time passes, the events of the war begin to spread across the Greek world. Stories are told, retold, and remembered. The Trojan War becomes more than just a conflict. It becomes a legend. What began as a single decision grew into years of war and ended in a moment of strategy. And long after the cities have changed and the people have faded, the story remains. A reminder of how fragile power can be, and how history is often shaped by choices made in quiet moments. As the years pass, the story of the war begins to take on a new form. It is no longer only remembered by those who lived through it. It is carried by storytellers. Across the Greek world, poets and travelers repeat the events of Troy. They speak of the long siege, the heroes, the final night, and the wooden horse. Over time, the details begin to shift. Some parts become clearer, others become larger than life. History slowly blends with legend. One of the most important figures in preserving this story is Homer. He does not simply record events. He turns them into something that can be remembered for generations. Through his works, the war becomes more than a sequence of events. It becomes a narrative about honor, pride, loss, and consequence. The story of Troy begins to influence how people think about war itself. It shows that strength alone is not enough, that even the most powerful cities can fall, and that decisions made by a few can affect thousands. Over time, the ruins of Troy remain, but the world around them changes. New cities rise, new conflicts begin, new leaders emerge, but the memory of this war continues to exist. For the people of the ancient world, it is not just a story about the past. It becomes a reference point, a way to understand power, strategy, and the limits of both. And as generations continue to pass, the story of the Trojan War remains elastic, not because of how it was written, but because of how often it was told, from a single decision to a war that lasted years, to a final night that changed everything. The story continues to echo through history, even long after the world that created it is gone. The story of the Trojan War continues to survive, not as a memory held by cities or kingdoms, but as a tale passed from voice to voice, from generation to generation. Over time, empires rise and fall across the ancient world. New cultures emerge. New leaders take power. But the story of Troy remains unchanged in its core. A war that began with a single decision. A city that stood for years against an army, and a moment of deception that ended it all. These events become more than history. They become lessons about trust, about strategy, about pride and consequence. And even as centuries pass, as languages change and civilizations disappear, the story continues to be told, because some stories are not remembered only for what happened, but for what they reveal about human nature itself. And so, the tale of Troy lives on, quietly, endlessly, carried through time. The story of Troy now fades into the past, becoming part of ancient memory. But the world of ancient Greece does not stop here. New city-states continue to rise. New conflicts begin to form. And a new chapter of history is about to unfold. Now we move forward in time, into a land shaped by discipline, war, and endurance. A place where strength is not only respected, but required for survival. This is where we begin the next story, the story of Sparta, and one of the most legendary stands in ancient history. In the years following the age of Troy, the Greek world was no longer a single unified force. Instead, it was divided into independent city-states, each with its own laws, armies, and identity. Among these city-states, one stood apart for its strict discipline and military focus: Sparta. Life in Sparta was built around preparation for war. From childhood, its people were trained to endure hardship, follow orders, and survive in the harshest conditions. Strength was not just encouraged, it was expected. While other cities focused on trade, philosophy, or art, Sparta focused on control, order, and warfare. And in time, this way of life would be tested. Far beyond the Greek world, a massive empire was expanding. Its reach stretched across continents, bringing many lands under its rule. Achaemenid Empire. This empire continued to grow until it reached the borders of Greece. At that moment, tension began to rise across the region. Smaller city-states faced a choice: submit or resist. Sparta chose resistance. As the Persian forces advanced, reports of their size and power spread quickly. The scale of the approaching army was unlike anything the Greeks had faced before, yet Sparta did not retreat. Instead, a decision was made that would define its legacy forever. A small group of warriors would be sent to block the Persian advance at a narrow mountain pass known as Thermopylae. Battle of Thermopylae. At the front of this force stood their king, Leonidas I. He did not gather a large army. He did not seek overwhelming numbers. He chose position, discipline, and strategy. The pass of Thermopylae was narrow. It limited the movement of large armies and forced combat into close quarters. For Sparta, this was the only chance to resist a far larger force. As the Persian army approached, the Spartans took their positions. The atmosphere was quiet. There was no chaos, no confusion, only preparation. This was not a battle of equal forces. It was a stand against inevitability. And as the first confrontation began, history entered one of its most remembered moments. As the Persian army approached, the Spartans took their positions. The atmosphere was quiet. There was no chaos, no confusion, only preparation. This was not a battle of equal forces. It was a stand against inevitability. And as the first confrontation began, history entered one of its most remembered moments. Leonidas I continued to lead from the front, maintaining control over the defense. The Persian army, despite its size, began to realize that the pass could not be taken easily. What was expected to be a quick advance turned into a prolonged struggle. Time passed differently in this place. Each day carried the same weight of pressure and anticipation. Inside Sparta, there was no panic. The soldiers had been trained for this kind of moment. Their entire life had prepared them for endurance under impossible conditions. And yet, the situation slowly changed. A path was discovered that allowed the Persian forces to bypass the main defense. It was not a direct confrontation anymore, but a strategic movement that threatened to surround the defenders. At this point, Leonidas made a decision. The majority of the Allied forces were allowed to withdraw. The remaining Spartans stayed behind. They knew what this meant. It was no longer about victory. It was about time. Time for the rest of Greece to prepare. Time for resistance to continue elsewhere. The final group remained at the pass. Not because they believed they could win, but because they had chosen not to retreat. And as the battle reached its final stage, Thermopylae became not just a military confrontation, but a symbol of endurance against overwhelming force. As the final phase of the battle began, the situation at Thermopylae became increasingly desperate. The narrow pass, once a strategic advantage, was now fully surrounded due to the bypass route discovered by the Persian forces. The remaining Spartan soldiers were no longer defending a position of strength, but holding a stand against encirclement. Battle of Thermopylae. Despite this, there was no collapse in discipline. The Spartans maintained formation and continued to resist in close combat, where training and coordination still mattered more than numbers. Leonidas the First. Leonidas remained with his men until the end. At this point, retreat was no longer possible, and survival was no longer the objective. The focus had shifted entirely to holding the line for as long as possible. The fighting became more compressed and chaotic as the space narrowed further. Each side pressed forward, but the Spartans continued to operate with structure, even under extreme pressure. Over time, the remaining forces were gradually reduced. The imbalance in numbers eventually became decisive. However, the resistance itself did not break in spirit or organization. In the final moments, the Spartans fought until they could no longer continue as a unit. The pass was ultimately taken, but only after significant delay and sustained resistance. After the battle, Thermopylae became known not for its outcome, but for the nature of the stand itself. A small force had delayed a vastly larger army through discipline and positioning alone. And in doing so, they changed how future generations would understand endurance, sacrifice, and military strategy. The story did not end with survival. It ended with memory. And that memory would be carried far beyond the battlefield, becoming one of the most enduring accounts of ancient Greece. After the fall of the Spartan defenders at Thermopylae, the Persian army continued its advance deeper into Greece. The path forward was now open, and several Greek city-states faced immediate pressure. Some chose to submit, hoping to avoid destruction. Others began to prepare for further resistance, but the stand at Thermopylae had already changed something important. It was no longer just a military event. It had become a message that resistance was possible, even against overwhelming odds. After the fall of the Spartan defenders at Thermopylae, the Persian army continued its advance deeper into Greece. The path forward was now open, and several Greek city-states faced immediate pressure. Some chose to submit, hoping to avoid destruction. Others began to prepare for further resistance, but the stand at Thermopylae had already changed something important. It was no longer just a military event. It had become a message that resistance was possible, even against overwhelming odds. The legacy of Thermopylae, however, did not fade. Instead, it became a reference point in Greek memory, a moment where strategy, geography, and human determination intersected in a way that left a lasting mark on history. And as the conflict continued to evolve, it was clear that Thermopylae was not the end of the story. It was only one chapter in a much larger war that would shape the future of the Greek world. After the events at Thermopylae, the Greek world entered a new phase of the war. The Persian advance had not been stopped on land, but it had not yet secured full control over Greece. The conflict was far from over. Greek city-states began to realize that survival would depend not only on land defenses, but also on naval power. The sea became the next critical battlefield. As Persian forces moved deeper into the region, many coastal cities faced pressure. Some were evacuated, others were abandoned. The war was no longer confined to a single front. It had become a full-scale struggle across the entire region. In response, the remaining Greek forces began to gather their ships. They formed a coordinated fleet, bringing together multiple city-states under a temporary alliance. This cooperation was not natural for them. These were independent cities, often in conflict with one another, but the scale of the threat forced unity. At sea, the decisive confrontation would soon take shape. A narrow strait, surrounded by land on both sides, became the center of attention. The geography limited movement, making large fleets less effective and tactical positioning more important. This location would become one of the most important naval battles in ancient history. As both sides prepared, the tension grew. The outcome of this stage of the war would determine the direction of the entire conflict. And unlike Thermopylae, where the battle was defined by sacrifice and endurance, this next confrontation would be shaped by strategy at sea. The Greek fleet gathered in silence, waiting for the moment when the Persian navy would enter the strait. And as the ships began to move into position, history prepared for its next turning point. The Persian navy entered the strait in large numbers, filling the water between the narrow coastal lines. Their fleet was designed for scale and dominance, intended to overwhelm by size alone. But the geography of the strait changed everything. The limited space reduced the advantage of having more ships. Instead of open sea combat, the battle became compressed, forcing ships into close and controlled encounters. The Greek fleet held its position carefully. They did not rush forward. Instead, they waited for the right moment, using the narrow waters to their advantage. As the Persian ships moved deeper into the strait, their formation began to lose coordination. The lack of space created confusion in movement and timing. This was exactly what the Greeks had anticipated. Once the Persian fleet was fully inside, the Greek ships began to engage. Fast, organized maneuvers replaced direct confrontation. Ships struck, retreated, and repositioned within the confined space, making it difficult for the larger fleet to respond effectively. The battle at sea became a test of control rather than strength. Where the Persians relied on numbers, the Greeks relied on structure, timing, and knowledge of the environment. Over time, the pressure inside the strait increased. Movement became restricted. Communication between ships became harder. The advantage of size continued to diminish. The Persian fleet, despite its scale, began to struggle to maintain order in the confined waters. And as the battle continued, it became clear that geography was now shaping the outcome more than numbers. This naval confrontation marked another turning point in the conflict. Thermopylae had shown the importance of terrain on land. This battle showed the same principle at sea. And together, these events began to shift the balance of the war. As the naval battle continued within the narrow strait, the situation for the Persian fleet became increasingly unstable. What had begun as a confident advance turned into a struggle for control. The confined waters limited movement, and the larger fleet could no longer operate with its intended coordination. Greek ships continued to use the environment to their advantage. They avoided unnecessary risks and focused on maintaining structure while applying pressure at key points. Over time, damage and confusion began to accumulate within the Persian formation. Communication between ships weakened, and organization started to break down. As the battle progressed, the balance that had initially favored scale began to shift. The advantage of numbers was reduced by the limitations of space and the effectiveness of coordinated resistance. Eventually, the Persian fleet began to withdraw from the strait. The retreat was not immediate, but gradual, as remaining forces attempted to regroup and regain control of the situation. This withdrawal marked a turning point in the conflict. For the first time since the Persian advance had begun, their momentum was significantly disrupted. With naval pressure reduced, the Greek city-states gained time to reorganize. Fortifications were strengthened, alliances were maintained, and preparation for further confrontation continued. However, the earlier events had already changed the direction of the war. Thermopylae had demonstrated endurance on land. The naval battle had shown the importance of strategy at sea. Together, these moments reshaped the conflict into something more balanced than it had been at the beginning. As time passed, the Persian campaign in Greece gradually lost its initial momentum. The costs of continued expansion increased, while resistance became more coordinated. Eventually, the campaign reached a stage where further advancement was no longer sustainable. The Persian forces began to withdraw from Greek territory, bringing the main phase of the invasion to an end. For the Greek world, the outcome was not defined by a single victory, but by a series of moments where strategy, geography, and unity played decisive roles. The war left a lasting impact on all sides involved. It reshaped political relationships within Greece, strengthened the identity of independent city-states, and became one of the most studied conflicts of the ancient world. And long after the events had ended, the story remained, not only as a record of battles, but as an example of how small forces, when guided by strategy and discipline, can influence the course of much larger events. After the Persian withdrawal, the Greek world did not immediately return to peace. Even though the external threat had been reduced, the internal structure of Greece remained divided. The city-states were still independent, and tensions between them continued to exist. Athens and Sparta, the two most influential powers, began to take different paths in rebuilding and defining their roles in the post-war world. Athens focused on rebuilding its city, strengthening its naval power, and developing trade and culture. Sparta maintained its strict military-focused system, emphasizing discipline and stability over expansion. Although they had fought on the same side during the invasion, their differences became more visible over time. The temporary unity created during the war slowly began to fade. This shift eventually led to a new period of tension within Greece itself. Alliances changed, influence shifted, and competition between city-states gradually increased. The external war had ended, but internal balance was still unstable. In the years that followed, Greece entered a new phase of its history, a period shaped not by invasion from outside forces, but by rivalry within. This would eventually lead to further conflicts between the Greek city-states, changing the political landscape once again. However, Despite these internal struggles, the events of the Persian War remained deeply significant. Thermopylae, the naval battles, and the coordinated resistance had all contributed to a shared historical memory. These moments became part of how the Greeks understood themselves, not as a single unified empire, but as independent states capable of collective resistance when necessary. And even as new conflicts emerged, the legacy of this period continued to influence future generations. A reminder that history is not shaped by a single event, but by a series of decisions, actions, and turning points over time. This period of relative stability in the Greek world began to change. The differences between the city-states, which had been temporarily set aside during the Persian Wars, slowly returned to the surface. Athens continued to grow in influence, expanding its power through trade, alliances, and naval strength. Its leadership position became more visible across the Aegean world. But this growing influence also created tension. Other major city-states began to feel that the balance of power was shifting too heavily toward Athens. Among them, Sparta remained cautious. Unlike Athens, Sparta did not focus on expansion or cultural development. Instead, it maintained its strict military system and its traditional way of life. As Athens expanded its influence, Sparta and its allies began to view this growth as a potential threat to the independence of other city-states. Over time, what had once been a united front against a common enemy slowly transformed into internal tension within Greece itself. The alliances formed during war began to weaken, and old rivalries resurfaced. This shift marked the beginning of a new phase in ancient Greek history, a phase no longer defined by invasion from outside forces, but by conflict between the Greek city-states themselves. And as this new tension grew, the stage was slowly being set for one of the longest and most important internal wars in the ancient Greek world. As tensions between the Greek city-states continued to grow, the fragile unity that had once formed during the Persian Wars slowly began to collapse. What started as disagreement over influence and leadership gradually turned into open hostility. Athens, with its expanding naval power and growing network of alliances, began to operate as a dominant force across the region. Its influence reached far beyond its own borders, shaping trade routes and political relationships. But this dominance was not accepted by everyone. Sparta and its allies viewed the situation differently. To them, Athens was becoming too powerful, too controlling, and too influential over other independent cities. This growing concern led to the formation of opposing alliances within Greece. On one side stood Athens and its supporters. On the other stood Sparta and those who feared Athenian expansion. At first, the tension remained indirect. Political pressure, disputes over alliances, and small conflicts between regions became more frequent. But over time, these smaller issues began to escalate. The balance that had once held the Greek world together was now breaking apart. Eventually, this tension could no longer be contained through diplomacy or negotiation. The conflict moved beyond politics and into open warfare. This marked the beginning of a long and devastating internal struggle within Greece, where former allies became enemies, and entire city-states were forced to choose sides. Unlike the wars against external empires, this conflict was different. It was not about survival against an invader, but about power, influence, and control within the Greek world itself. And as this new war began to unfold, it would shape the future of ancient Greece in ways that no previous conflict had ever done before. As the conflict between Athens and Sparta expanded, the war began to spread across the entire Greek world. It was no longer limited to isolated disputes or small regional clashes. Entire alliances were now fully engaged, and the scale of the conflict continued to grow. Cities that had once focused on trade, culture, or local governance were now drawn into a larger struggle. Resources were redirected toward war, and daily life in many regions began to change. The nature of the conflict was different from previous wars. Instead of a single battlefield or a clear front line, fighting occurred in multiple regions, both on land and at sea. Naval power played a crucial role, especially for Athens, while Sparta relied more on its disciplined land forces and its allies across the Greek mainland. As the war continued, both sides experienced periods of advantage and setback. Control over territories shifted repeatedly, and no side was able to secure a permanent victory in the early stages. This created a prolonged state of uncertainty across the region. Athens faced increasing pressure as the war extended over time. Its reliance on maritime strength and external supplies became a critical factor in its ability to continue the conflict. At the same time, Sparta maintained its structured military approach, focusing on sustained land campaigns and strategic alliances. As years passed, the war began to affect not only armies and leaders, but also ordinary people. Economic strain, population movement, and social disruption became more visible across the Greek world. What had begun as a political rivalry between two major city-states had now transformed into a prolonged and exhausting conflict involving much of ancient Greece. And as the war continued, it became clear that its consequences would extend far beyond the battlefield itself. As the war between Athens and Sparta continued, both sides began to experience deeper internal strain. Resources were becoming limited, alliances were less stable, and the prolonged nature of the conflict made it increasingly difficult for either side to maintain long-term dominance. Within Athens, pressure on leadership grew as the war extended further than many had originally expected. Naval operations remained crucial, but sustaining them over time became more challenging. At the same time, Sparta and its allies continued their land-based campaigns, maintaining discipline but also facing the slow demands of a long war. Over time, the conflict began to shift from rapid military movements to a more exhausting and drawn-out struggle. Battles alone were no longer decisive. Strategy, endurance, and resource management became just as important as direct confrontation. Eventually, this prolonged struggle led both sides to a point where continued expansion or decisive victory became increasingly difficult to achieve. The war had reshaped the political landscape of the Greek world, but it also created exhaustion on both sides. As the war dragged on, it became clear that neither side could maintain endless pressure without consequences. The prolonged conflict had changed the Greek world in ways that went beyond military outcomes. Cities were weakened, populations were strained, and the balance of power was no longer as stable as it once had been. Eventually, both Athens and Sparta began to face moments where continuation of the war became increasingly difficult to sustain at the same level. Even victories no longer brought lasting advantage because each gain came with significant cost. In this final stage of the conflict, exhaustion played a major role. Resources were limited, alliances were less reliable, and the ability to maintain long campaigns was reduced for both sides. The war had shifted from expansion to endurance. Over time, this pressure led to a gradual conclusion of the conflict. Hostilities began to slow, and the intensity of large-scale operations decreased. What remained was not a clear moment of absolute victory, but rather a shift toward a fragile form of peace. Athens and Sparta both emerged from the war changed. Neither side had achieved complete dominance, but both had been deeply affected by the long struggle. The political structure of the Greek world was no longer the same as before. Power had shifted, alliances had changed, and trust between city-states had been significantly reduced. In the aftermath, ancient Greece entered a new phase of instability. The effects of the war continued to influence relationships between city-states for years to come. Even after the fighting stopped, the consequences of the conflict remained present in daily life, governance, and regional politics. And as this period came to a close, ancient Greece stood transformed, not unified, not fully stable, but shaped by one of the longest and most important internal conflicts in its history. For great empires ruled the world, there was a quiet beginning. In the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, between two great rivers, life began to organize itself into something new. Small settlements slowly began to grow, houses made of mud and stone, simple streets forming over time, and people learning to live together in a shared space. One of these early places was a city called Ur, a quiet beginning of something much larger. There was no rush in this world, no loud expansion, only slow growth, shaped by rivers, soil, and time. The Euphrates River flowed nearby, bringing water, life, and movement to the land. Farmers learned to follow its rhythm, planting, waiting, and harvesting in silence. The city slowly became more organized. Paths became streets, homes became neighborhoods, and life became shared between people who once lived separately. There were no sudden changes, only gradual transformation, as if the land itself was gently shaping human life. And as you imagine this ancient city, you are not observing history from far away. You are standing inside it. The air is warm and still. The sound of water is distant but constant, and everything feels simple and calm. Time moves slowly here, almost like it is resting. And as you walk through the early streets of Ur, you begin to feel something familiar. A quiet stillness, the same kind of calm that gently guides you toward sleep. The ancient world continues around you, softly, quietly, as you slowly begin to drift within the history of Mesopotamia. As the city of Ur continued to grow, something important began to change. Growth brought more people, more trade, and more conflict. When people began living closer together, disagreements became more common. Land disputes, trade arguments, questions of fairness and punishment. For a long time, these issues were solved differently by different people. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was written. But as Ur expanded, this system started to fail. That is when a ruler named Ur-Nammu began to act. He ruled the city during a time when order was becoming necessary for survival, and he understood something clearly. A growing city cannot rely only on memory and opinion. So he introduced something new, laws that were written down, not spoken differently by each person, not changed depending on who had power, but fixed, recorded, visible to everyone. These laws dealt with everyday life, trade, property, disputes, and justice between people. For the first time, people in Ur could understand the rules that governed them in the same way. This marked one of the earliest steps toward organized law in human history. And in that moment, Ur was no longer just a growing city. It was becoming a structured society. As these changes spread through daily life, Mesopotamia slowly moved toward a new era where civilization was no longer only about survival, but about order. Trade, property, disputes, and justice between people. For the first time, people in Ur could understand the rules that governed them in the same way. This marked one of the earliest steps toward organized law in human history. And in that moment, Ur was no longer just a growing city. It was becoming a structured society. As these changes spread through daily life, Mesopotamia slowly moved toward a new era where civilization was no longer only about survival, but about order. As the city-states of Mesopotamia continued to grow, life became more complex. In early cities like Ur, people followed simple traditions to solve their problems. But as populations increased, this system slowly began to break down. Different cities had different rules, and even within the same city, justice could change depending on who was judging. What was considered a crime in one place could be completely acceptable in another. This created confusion and instability across the region. During this time, Babylon began to rise. What was once a small city slowly became a powerful center controlling surrounding lands. At the heart of this rise was a ruler named Hammurabi. Hammurabi was not only focused on conquest or expansion, his true goal was order. He understood something important. A kingdom cannot survive on strength alone. It also needs structure. So he introduced a new idea for his time, written laws that applied to everyone in the kingdom. These laws were not based on memory or personal judgment. They were carved into stone and displayed publicly for all to see. For the first time, justice became visible and consistent. People no longer had to guess what was right or wrong. The rules were the same for everyone, regardless of wealth or status. This transformed Babylon into more than just a powerful city. It became an organized state built on law and structure, and from this moment, Mesopotamia entered a new era where the challenge was no longer just building cities, but creating systems that could govern them. As Mesopotamia entered this new era, power slowly began to shift again. Babylon was no longer just a rising city. It was becoming a center of influence across the region. But history in this land never stayed still for long. New kingdoms were always forming. New rulers were always emerging. And the balance of power was constantly changing. Even with Hammurabi's laws, even with written justice, the region was still shaped by ambition, expansion, and control. Because in Mesopotamia, order and conflict always existed side by side. Cities could rise quickly and fall just as fast. And as time moved forward, new powers would begin to challenge Babylon's influence, bringing stronger armies, larger territories, and harsher rule. But the foundation had already been laid. The idea that a civilization is not only built by strength, but also by laws, systems, and structure. And this idea, first written in stone in Babylon, would spread far beyond Mesopotamia, shaping every empire that came after it. From this point on, history was no longer just about survival. It was about control, organization, and legacy. And as the world of Mesopotamia continued to evolve, new empires were already waiting to rise, bringing the next chapter of ancient history. As time moved forward in Mesopotamia, new powers began to rise from the north. These were not quiet city-states like before. They were organized, disciplined, and expansion-focused kingdoms. Among them, one name would become especially feared and remembered: the Assyrians. They built their power on strict order, strong armies, and complete control over conquered lands. Where earlier civilizations focused on building cities, the Assyrians focused on controlling entire regions. Their expansion was fast and often harsh. Cities that resisted were not easily forgiven, and their reputation spread far beyond their borders. But like all powers in Mesopotamia, they were also part of a repeating pattern: rise, expansion, control, and eventual decline, because in this land no empire stayed permanent. The same rivers that gave life also witnessed the fall of countless rulers and cities. And while new empires rose and fell, the legacy of earlier civilizations remained. The idea of written laws, organized cities, and structured rule continued to shape everything that came after. Mesopotamia was no longer just a collection of cities. It had become the foundation of civilization itself. And from here, history would continue toward even greater empires, including the rise of Babylon once again, under its most famous kings, and the golden age that would follow. After the rise and fall of early empires in Mesopotamia, Babylon would rise once again, but this time stronger than before. Centuries passed, and the city slowly transformed into a center of power, culture, and architecture. At the heart of this new Babylonian era stood one of its most famous kings, Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar II. Under his rule, Babylon reached its greatest height. The city was no longer just a political center. It became a symbol of civilization itself. Massive walls surrounded the city, designed not only for protection, but also to show its strength. Great structures were built across Babylon: wide streets, monumental gates, and impressive temples dedicated to the gods. Among the most famous of these structures was the grand entrance to the city, the Ishtar Gate. Ishtar Gate. Its deep blue walls and detailed reliefs reflected the power and wealth of Babylon during this time. Visitors entering the city would immediately feel its dominance and importance. But Babylon was not only about power, it was also about culture, knowledge, and identity. Astronomy, writing, mathematics, and religion all developed further during this period. Everything that had slowly begun in earlier Mesopotamian cities now reached a peak under Babylon's golden age. And yet, even in its greatest moment, the cycle of history in Mesopotamia remained the same. No empire stayed forever. Because in this land, every rise carried the seed of its own decline. And as Babylon stood at its peak, history was already preparing the next transformation, a reminder that even the greatest cities are part of a much larger story of time. After the golden age of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II, the city remained powerful for a time. But history in Mesopotamia was never stable for long. Great empires in this land rarely faded in a single moment. Instead, their strength slowly weakened over time as new powers began to rise around them. Babylon, once the center of civilization, began to face pressure from expanding kingdoms beyond its borders. The same cycle that had shaped Mesopotamia for thousands of years was happening again. Rise, dominance, and gradual decline. Even the most advanced cities, with their laws, temples, and grand architecture, could not escape this pattern, because Mesopotamia was not defined by one empire, but by a continuous flow of civilizations replacing one another. And as Babylon's influence slowly weakened, new forces from different regions began to shape the future of the ancient world. These powers would carry forward what Mesopotamia had created: writing, law, and organized society, but they would expand it into something even larger. The legacy of Babylon did not disappear. It spread. It influenced future empires, future cities, and future systems of governance. What began in places like what was written in early laws, and what was perfected in Babylon, became the foundation for later civilizations far beyond Mesopotamia. And so the story of this land does not truly end here. It transforms. Because Mesopotamia was never just a place of empires. It was the beginning of civilization itself. Let's move slowly on. In ancient Egypt, life was shaped by a single natural system, the Nile River. Each year, at a predictable yet powerful moment, the river would rise beyond its banks. This was not simply a natural event. It was the foundation of an entire civilization. Before sunrise, the Nile often appeared calm, its surface still, almost motionless. But this silence was deceptive, because beneath it, a slow and powerful transformation was approaching. The river dictated where people lived, how they farmed, and when they worked. In this world, nature was not separate from life. It was life itself. Daily life in ancient Egypt was not measured by clocks. It was governed by natural cycles. Sunrise marked the beginning of activity. Communities started their work early, before the heat became intense. Labor was organized collectively, with farming, construction, and water management shared among groups. Silence in the morning was not emptiness, it was preparation, a signal that life was about to begin its daily rhythm. Survival depended on coordination rather than individuality. The Nile's annual flooding was the most important agricultural event in ancient Egypt. During this period, the river overflowed its banks and covered the surrounding land. When the waters eventually receded, they left behind a thick layer of dark, nutrient-rich silt. This natural deposit acted as a highly fertile soil. It allowed crops to grow in an otherwise dry environment. Without this cycle, large-scale agriculture would not have been possible. The entire food system depended on the predictability of this flooding pattern. Despite its benefits, the Nile was never fully predictable. Some years the floodwaters were too low. This resulted in poor soil coverage and reduced harvests. Other years the waters rose too high. Entire fields and settlements could be damaged or destroyed. Thus, the Nile represented both stability and uncertainty at the same time. Ancient Egyptian society lived within this constant balance between abundance and loss. Over time, the Egyptians developed methods to observe and record the behavior of the river. Flood levels, seasonal changes, and agricultural outcomes were carefully monitored. These observations formed one of the earliest environmental knowledge systems in human history. Instead of attempting to control nature, they adapted to it. This adaptation became the foundation of long-term survival. The Nile was not just a river. It was a natural calendar, a system, and a guide for civilization. Ancient Egyptian life was built on repetition and cycles. Flood, planting, growth, and harvest. These stages repeated every year with remarkable consistency. There was no fixed beginning or end, only continuity. As long as the Nile continued to flow, the civilization continued to exist. A system not built on control, but on rhythm. A rhythm defined entirely by nature. Beyond the immediate agricultural cycle, the Nile flood system shaped the entire structure of ancient Egyptian civilization. It was not only a source of water, it was the backbone of administration, economy, and social order. Because agricultural output depended entirely on the river's behavior, centralized coordination became essential. Food production had to be measured, stored, and distributed with precision. This led to the development of early bureaucratic systems. Officials were assigned to monitor land, record harvest yields, and manage grain storage facilities. In many ways, ancient Egypt became one of the earliest examples of a state organized around environmental dependency. The concept of time itself was influenced by the Nile. Instead of abstract calendars, Egyptians divided the year based on natural phases of the river. Three main seasons emerged: the flooding period, the planting period, and the harvest period. Each phase dictated human activity across the entire civilization. This structure created a predictable rhythm in an otherwise unpredictable natural environment. However, this predictability was never absolute. Minor variations in flood levels could still disrupt entire economic cycles. Storage became one of the most critical innovations of the time. Grain was collected and preserved in large, state-controlled granaries. These storage systems acted as buffers against environmental instability. In years of abundance, excess production was stored. In years of shortage, stored grain was redistributed to prevent famine. This mechanism reduced the impact of Nile unpredictability and allowed population stability over long periods. The Nile also influenced settlement geography. Most major cities developed along narrow strips of fertile land near the riverbanks. Beyond these zones lay vast desert regions that were largely uninhabitable. This created a highly concentrated population structure. Urban centers, agricultural zones, and administrative hubs were all tightly linked along the river's course. As a result, communication and transport were primarily water-based. The Nile functioned as both a resource and a transportation network. Religious and cultural interpretations also emerged from this dependency. The annual flooding was often associated with divine order. Rather than being seen as random natural events, the cycles of the river were integrated into belief systems. The consistency of the flood reinforced the idea of cosmic balance and renewal. This helped reinforce social stability during uncertain environmental conditions. By observing the long-term patterns of the river, ancient Egyptians achieved something remarkable for their time: a sustainable system built not on controlling nature, but on aligning with it. This balance between adaptation and dependency defined their civilization for thousands of years. And even today, the Nile remains one of the clearest historical examples of how geography can shape human history. As the Nile cycle continued year after year, its influence extended far beyond agriculture. It gradually shaped the entire economic and social structure of ancient Egypt. Because survival depended on the river's consistency, society developed around a centralized system of coordination. Food production, storage, and distribution were no longer isolated activities. They became part of a larger organized framework. The redistribution of grain played a key role in maintaining stability across the population. After harvest seasons, surplus crops were collected and stored in state-controlled granaries. These granaries were not simple storage buildings. They functioned as economic safety systems. In years of strong floods and abundant harvests, grain reserves increased significantly. In contrast, during weak flood years, these reserves were released to prevent widespread famine. This mechanism allowed ancient Egypt to survive environmental fluctuations that would otherwise destabilize agricultural societies. Over time, this system required administration. Officials were appointed to measure harvest yields, track land productivity, and record agricultural output. Written records became essential for managing resources across large regions. This led to one of the earliest known bureaucratic systems in human history. Administration was not separate from daily life. It was embedded within it. Settlement patterns also reflected this organization. Most population centers developed along a narrow, fertile strip directly influenced by the Nile. This strip was surrounded by vast desert regions, which acted as natural boundaries. As a result, human habitation was highly concentrated. Cities, farms, and administrative centers were closely connected through river-based transportation. The Nile itself served as a logistical network. It enabled movement of goods, people, and information across long distances with relative efficiency. This geographic concentration also influenced political control. Since most of the population lived along a single corridor, centralized authority could be maintained more effectively. This contributed to the development of a unified state structure earlier than in many other ancient regions. Power was not distributed across isolated settlements. It was aligned along a single environmental axis. Religious and cultural interpretations also evolved alongside these systems. The repeated flooding cycle was not viewed as random chaos. Instead, it was perceived as a structured, natural order. The pattern of destruction and renewal became symbolic of continuity and balance. This interpretation reinforced societal stability during uncertain environmental periods. Natural events were integrated into a broader worldview that emphasized harmony rather than unpredictability. Education and knowledge transfer also played a role in maintaining this system. Experience-based understanding of the Nile was passed across generations. Changes in flood intensity, soil behavior, and agricultural timing were carefully observed and remembered. This accumulated knowledge created long-term environmental awareness. It allowed society to adapt without needing constant technological innovation. Instead, adaptation was based on observation and continuity. Over centuries, the Nile ceased to be viewed merely as a river. It became the organizing principle of civilization itself. It defined where people lived, how they worked, how they governed, and even how they understood the passage of time. Without the Nile, the structure of ancient Egyptian civilization would not have been possible in the same form. But because of it, one of the most enduring civilizations in human history was able to develop and sustain itself for thousands of years. By this stage, The Nile was no longer just an environmental force shaping agriculture or settlement patterns. It had become the underlying structure of time, stability, and meaning within ancient Egyptian civilization. Every cycle of flood and recession reinforced a fundamental truth. Human survival in this region was not based on control over nature, but on adaptation to it. As the river continued its annual rhythm, a deeper understanding of continuity began to emerge. The same fields that were submerged one season would reappear fertile in the next. The same land that seemed lost beneath water would return transformed. This repetition created a perception of renewal embedded into everyday life. Nothing was ever truly permanent, and yet nothing was ever completely lost. This cyclical structure influenced how time itself was perceived. Unlike linear systems where time moves from a defined beginning toward an end, the Nile introduced a repeating model of existence. Flood, recession, cultivation, harvest, and then repetition. Each cycle was both an ending and a beginning. This blurred the boundary between past and future. Over generations, this cycle became deeply embedded in cultural consciousness. The river was not only observed as a physical phenomenon, but also interpreted as a symbol of order within change. Even unpredictable variations in flood strength were incorporated into this worldview. Instead of being seen as disruption, they were understood as part of a larger, continuous system. At the level of society, this created a form of resilience that did not rely on resistance to environmental forces. Instead, it relied on synchronization. Infrastructure, agriculture, administration, and settlement were all designed to follow the rhythm of the Nile. When the river rose, activity shifted. When it receded, production resumed. When the land reappeared, cultivation began again. The entire civilization moved in response to this pattern. In this sense, ancient Egypt did not attempt to dominate its environment. It structured itself around it. This distinction is critical in understanding its long-term stability. Rather than fighting against uncertainty, it absorbed uncertainty into its system. Variability became expected, and expectation reduced instability. Even the concept of continuity was redefined. What modern perspective might interpret as disruption, flooding, land loss, seasonal change, was instead integrated as a necessary phase of existence. Each transformation of the landscape was part of a larger repeating system that never fully stopped, only shifted, only evolved. As centuries passed, this relationship between civilization and river remained consistent. Dynasties rose and fell, but the Nile cycle continued without interruption. Empires changed, rulers changed, technologies evolved, yet the fundamental rhythm remained the same. The river maintained its course, and civilization maintained its alignment with it. From a historical perspective, this creates a unique case study, a civilization not defined by conquest or expansion alone, but by environmental synchronization over thousands of years. Its endurance was not accidental, it was structural, built into the geography itself, and ultimately, the Nile represents more than a river in historical analysis. It represents a system in which nature and human organization were inseparably linked. A system where stability was not achieved through control, but through repetition, not through domination, but through adaptation. As the cycle continues beyond recorded history, the same pattern persists even today in a different form. The river still flows, the land still responds, and the logic of that ancient system remains one of the clearest examples of how geography can shape not just civilization, but the very structure of human existence.